This is part two of a four-part series that I term teaching videos. And in this part two video, we'll look at biblical creation. We'll look at the scientific support that biblical creation has as reported in the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And in that 31 verse first chapter, you will see that there is a historical account presented as to what God did when he created various parts of the world as we know it. It begins with God creating the universe, God creating then the earth, God creating plants on earth, God creating animals, God creating man, and various other aspects of the life on earth as we know it. So I believe it's a historical account. If you read that first chapter, I don't see where anyone would see any science there. It's therefore a mystery to me why, for the last 150 years, the battle between evolution theory and biblical creation has been fought on the science battlefront. Evolution theory, as we've seen in the first part, is trying to become a scientific area. It's no longer that, or has not reached that point yet, but it is trying to become a science applying some scientific concepts to the data that are observed in terms of evolution. Biblical creation, on the other hand, is not a science at all and has no aspects of science. So why would those two be fighting on the battlefield of science? I do not know, and I cannot answer that for you. But what we'll look at this video will be the historical account, and I'll demonstrate to you some of the scientific support that have arrived in recent years and decades that give you firm support, scientific support, for that history which is biblical creation. Let's look at some additional information about this. Now, biblical creation basically states that God made the universe and all species of life and really everything that is in the universe. So it states that God made everything. There was a supreme being, we call him God, and he made all of these things of his own intention. Biblical creation, as I've stated already, is historical. It just says what happened when, but it's not a science. And so we can't analyze biblical creation as a science, but we can look at science that supports biblical creation. Let's just look a little bit more detail about this historical account of the creation acts of God. It consisted of 6 days of creation, as you all perhaps know. And in terms of what happened on these days, you see that on days 1 and 2, God created the entire universe. And that's shown in the first 8 verses of Genesis chapter 1. On day 3, God created the earth, and he created vegetation in the next few verses. And then in day 4, the only thing that was going on in terms of growing beings was that vegetation continued to grow. God did other things there, other historically reported things, but in terms of living beings, on day 4, the only thing that happened was that vegetation continued to grow. On day 5, activities mainly involving water and air occurred, in which water creatures were created, fish, something that were called sea monsters, and birds. Now, this sea monster term depends upon the translation of the Bible that you look at. In many of the translations, this is translated as sea monster. In others, it's a big whale. In general, it's a large creature that God created. And then, finally, birds were created on day 5. Day 6 was the main day in which mammals and earth land-based beings were created, where cattle were created, it says specifically, other land animals, and finally man. So there is the biblical creation history, occurred in 6 days, and these are the individual things that are mentioned that were created. God did not mention additional things, but this is what God mentioned in the first chapter of the book of Genesis that was his creation activities. Now, several questions come up, of course. One of the dominant ones is this idea of 6 days. It's reported explicitly that the creation occurred in 6 days. The beginning and ending of each day is reported, and each day is reported explicitly to be 24 hours long. So there's little doubt that there were 6 days and little doubt that they lasted 24 hours long. And this is a subject that causes some people who are beginners in reading the Bible some consternation. How could it possibly have happened in 6 days with only 24 hours to do all of these massive things? And so the questions that come up are, first of all, which clock measured this time? So it was 6 days reported, and it's reported that the sun and earth were created on day 3. So for sure, an earth-based clock could not have marked this time for at least for days 1 and 2. And so it cannot be an earth-based clock. And the question is there a clock for the entire universe? And we'll see as we look at a few videos beyond that there has been something discovered called the cosmic clock. And we're going to have to look at a couple scientific areas, the Big Bang area and Einstein's relativity, to get a little bit into the science of it. But you need to go into those two areas so that you can understand what this cosmic clock is. And we're going to see rather astonishingly that the cosmic clock, which comes from the so-called cosmic background radiation, has been ticking for only 6 days. So creation did occur in 6 days, says the only clock capable of measuring that, the cosmic background radiation clock, and they were each 24 hours long, as reported in the Bible. The Bible just does not say which clock was used to measure this time. And I think we've seen here it's not the Earth's clock, but it is and can be this cosmic background radiation clock. We'll see this in a few videos in more detail in the next few slides, I do mean. Now, the other thing that's reported in creation, as we've already seen, is living beings were created in a specific sequence. The plants first, and then some sea creatures, and then some land-based creatures, and then finally man was created at the tail end of this 6-day creation period. And the question that we can ask is, the Bible gives us the sequence, and how does that compare to the fossil record that we have? We've already seen fossils in the part 1 video where these have been amassed of various types and various times these fossilized, or these particular species that are now fossilized, appeared on Earth. And we're going to see that the biblical creation account, the history of biblical creation, removes the contradictions we talked about in evolution theory, and really explains what's going on in the fossil record far better than those difficulties that the evolution theory has with it. In other words, life forms actually appeared just when the biblical creation reports they did appear. So it's kind of an amazing thing. This is just kind of a preview of what you're going to see in the remainder of this video, and really you will see some of this in the parts 3 and 4 as well, but mainly in here part 2, where you answer and look at these two areas about 6 days of creation and the sequence and the fossil record that supports it. So the first thing we need to do is look at the Big Bang Theory. We're ultimately going to see that it is the Big Bang Law. It passed the test of being a science. But we're going to need to look at it and analyze it and try to understand why this is a good scientific, well-developed area. Now the reason why the Big Bang came about is that in 1929, an American astronomer by the name of Edwin Hubble, who is now the namesake of the Hubble telescope that NASA has orbiting the Earth, he made a discovery that kind of stunned the scientific world, at least the cosmologists and the astronomers, if not the physicists. And that was the discovery that galaxies other than ours, our galaxy is called the Milky Way galaxy, but galaxies other than our galaxy were flying away from each other, in some cases at very high rates of speed. In other words, the universe was expanding. At the time when Hubble made this announcement and showed the information, the data that he had about this, it was not received by all as a very believable thing. From the time of Isaac Newton thought, and almost all the physicists and scientists that followed him up until the time of Edwin Hubble published this paper, they all thought that the universe was just a static, constant thing that was always there in the form that we see it when we look at it. Yes, occasionally there was a comet that would pass by, or there was a planet that would pass by that we would see, but by and large, the universe that we can see from our position here on Earth was basically always the way it was, and it was unchanging. Well, with Hubble finding out that it was expanding, this led obviously to the conclusion that if it's expanding now, at some time it must, earlier time it must have expanded less, and if you take that all the way to zero time in some sense, you find that it had to all start out as a very small mass, and that's what's pictured here in this slide, this plot on the left here, that we've got everything, all matter, all energy from the universe confined to a very small dot, very small region before the Big Bang happened. This was at trillions, tens of trillions of degrees of temperature, we believe, and it was all the energy that is and ever will be in that particular location. What happened at some point in time, a supreme being, God, decided to form the universe, and what needed to happen was that first the universe had to expand a bit, and this was an aspect to the Big Bang law that during its development as a theory had to be added. It had to expand a bit before the third stage here when it all blew up. So the first thing that happened is all the energy is confined to a dot, it expanded greatly, and then it blew up in what we call a homogeneous explosion. Now, homogeneous explosion is different from explosions that you perhaps have encountered, such as a firecracker, dynamite, or even a nuclear detonation. All of those detonations are just point explosions, where at a certain point everything blows away from that point, and you can find where the initial point was that this explosion happened. A homogeneous explosion is something different in that everything is flying away from everything else. Everything wants to get away from everything else all at once. And that's why I've drawn these arrows kind of going in all directions, everything trying to get away from everything else. That's a homogeneous explosion. Now, when this happened, it is now believed and known within this theory that as this expansion occurred and as the universe got larger, it cooled off. This initially tens of trillions of degrees temperature in the dot at the beginning cooled off to lower temperatures as this universe expanded in volume. And we know now that when it reached about 10.9 trillion degrees, and that's not a calculated or a guessed number, that's an actual measured number that we get from particle accelerator experiments done here on Earth, that when we got to 10.9 trillion degrees, when it expanded enough to cool to that temperature, at that point no more energy can be converted into matter. That is the point beyond which all the matter that's ever going to have been formed will have been formed, and the remaining energy will just have to remain as energy itself. And in fact, that remaining energy was released and dragged along with the expanding universe and is known as cosmic radiation. And we'll see how that plays into the idea of it being a clock and being an integral part of explaining how these 6 days of creation occurred. So that's the Big Bang. If you need more information, under the video tab there is a 15 or 20 minute further discussion or more detailed discussion of the Big Bang theory. But this is what it is, that the universe started out as a dot and is expanding. Now, if you remember from the first video when we had the scientific method, we will apply the scientific method to the Big Bang theory and see whether it all works out, if it becomes a law, and we're going to see that it does become a proven science, a law. So what is the observation? First of all, that the universe is not static, it's expanding. They're moving away from each other at high velocities, and that as a consequence of observing that, one believes that all energy and matter was confined to a very small region, a very high density, very high temperature, and then it blew apart or exploded. And the observation that Hubble made, and those who immediately followed him for a few years and decades, was that, yeah, this all seemed to be happening. Other astronomers found that there were galaxies, other galaxies that Hubble had not noted, were also flying away from each other. In some cases, in later years, many years since Hubble's discovery, and more sophisticated telescopes, and ironically with the Hubble telescope in outer space, one found that there are some galaxies at the edge of the universe that are still flying away from us and from all other galaxies at very close to the speed of light. We'll see in a few minutes a very high speed at which they were happening. So, what was the conclusion about the Big Bang Law, when it was, or predictions that were made as a result of looking at the Big Bang Law? And here were two of the major predictions that were made. First of all, if that's, as I just described to you, has happily occurred, there should be some radiation left over from the Big Bang, that not all energy was converted into matter. So there should be some background radiation, some signal left over somewhere that explains or that accounts for the fact that the Big Bang actually happened. And a further detail that was immediately realized, that is, if this radiation is found, it should not be coming exactly uniformly in all directions. It should be irregular, and a very slight amount irregular, because otherwise there would not be possible to form galaxies and stars. If it were exactly uniform, there would be no planets and no stars and no galaxies. It would just be a uniform distribution of this matter throughout space. So it had to be slightly non-uniform, and it was going to be very difficult to measure that. So those were the two predictions I made. And so how did these predictions come out? Well, there were a couple of IBM scientists who were working in upstate New York, and they had what was called a radio telescope. They were not astronomers in the sense that they were looking for light rays coming from space. They were radio astronomers, so-called, looking for radio signals, a different frequency that we can't see, looking for radio signals coming from outer space to look for potentially signals coming from outer space or information coming from outer space. They started to set up this radio telescope, which is basically a big series of antennas, and they were trying to get it all set and debugged and working. And one of the problems that they had at the tail end that they just could not get rid of was this excess noise. There was a noise in their radio telescope that they had to eliminate, so that if they ever did see a signal coming from outer space, they would know that it was not noise coming from Earth. So they did everything they could under the sun. They shut down, they came in on Sunday mornings or Sunday afternoons and shut down the freeway nearby. They shut down a power plant. They did something with a small airport nearby, and all in an effort to try to remove and find the source of this noise so they understand what it was. All efforts were to avail. They could not find out where this noise was coming from. The noise was always there. Somewhere along the line, one of the two of them went to a lecture that was going on at a nearby university, and someone was talking about the Big Bang Law, or Big Bang Theory, I guess more correctly I should say. And when they talked about this, they mentioned that there should be some remnant signal, some remnant radiation that should be found to prove or to demonstrate that the Big Bang Theory actually happened. Of course, this clicked, and long story short, in 1959 this was discovered, and then a number of years later, the two discoverers were given the Nobel Prize for having discovered this predicted cosmic background radiation, which we're going to see in a little bit is an integral part of this cosmic clock. So that background radiation was discovered. And as far as they could tell, it was really quite uniform in direction, so they couldn't do anything about this second part that we had that should be somewhat non-uniform. Well, in 1989, NASA launched a satellite called the COBE satellite, and that satellite's specific purpose was to look at this background radiation and to look at it up in outer space where it was not hindered by the atmospheric effects, and to measure the directional characteristic of it. And lo and behold, they found very small but very important differences in the intensity of this radiation coming from different directions, which is exactly what was predicted by the Big Bang Theory. And as a result, now the Big Bang Theory is the Big Bang Law, and it is a proven science. It has passed the tests of the scientific method application, and it is a law. But this is only one part that is going to lead us to the cosmic clock. We need to look at an additional area of science, something that hardly any of us can really understand or accept, but is a proven law of science, and that is Einstein's relativity law. Now, Albert Einstein was a genius that most of us have heard, at least his name, and know a little bit about what he did. And his relativity theory is special, and other versions of his theory are are so complicated and so complex that very few of us can understand all the details of what is done. And if I were to give you a scientific method explanation, just like I gave you for the Big Bang Theory and drew it on boards, it would take slide after slide after slide for all the implications of the relativity theory, and net result would be that all of those have been proven to be true. Predictions that were made by this theory decades later were proven when we got the technology to be able to prove it. I just want to look at one aspect of that, which is perhaps the most important aspect of Einstein's relativity law, and it is that the passage of time is not the same everywhere in the universe. I mean, this was a mind-boggling result for Einstein to report. You and I living on Earth and all of our prior relatives or whatever had sundials or watches or clocks of some kind, and as far as we know, an hour is an hour and a day is a day and a year is a year, and it doesn't seem to be changing in any kind of measurable way. But what Einstein determined was that the passage of time is not constant everywhere in the universe. And this equation here, and this is the only equation I'll have in all four of these video types, says that if you were measured an interval of time on Earth, say with any one clock that you had, a pendulum clock or a stopwatch or a Rolex or any other kind of time measuring device, if then you gave that same measuring device to another person, another being, and put them in a different part of the universe that was moving, maybe in a rocket or some such, at a very high rate of speed, that person would measure a different elapsed quantity of time. And the relationship between those two is shown here in this square root, 1 over square root term here. It looks a little bit complicated, but actually relatively simply mathematically. And what it says, and what Einstein determined, was that if that person is moving at a velocity v, a speed relative to the velocity of light, that you take his speed and do this calculation to see what these two different time intervals would be. In this equation, if the person is traveling at a velocity v that's very close to the speed of light, this term here can easily be millions and billions. Easily be millions and billions if you're going very close to the speed of light. If you're going very slow at the speed of light, it's basically 1. So if we're going very quickly, very high speed at the speed of light, and this term is billions, then let's see what the consequence is. Suppose that the person with this watch is traveling very close to the speed of light, and he measures 1 day on his watch. His time interval on his watch is 1 day. Well, Einstein's law says that 1 day times 1 billion means that on Earth you would have measured 1 billion days. Now this is something so outside of our experience and so hard to believe that most of us just say, oh, that's ridiculous, that cannot happen. You can't have the same watch going at a different rate of speed for someone traveling at a high velocity versus someone traveling at a low velocity. But no, it is actually true. In fact, this equation has been proven. There have been tests done with the fact that we can now measure very accurately what clocks are doing. You take 2 atomic clocks, very accurate clocks that depend upon the frequency of atoms moving. You get them tuned to exactly the same time, sitting on a bench, for example. You give one to a jogger. The jogger goes off and runs at moderate speed for 15-20 minutes and returns carrying that atomic clock, which initially said the same time. You'll find out that then it has been verified that that clock is actually moved and has slowed down actually a measurable quantity of time as a result of moving at that small velocity with that runner during that period of time. The same tests have been done with airplanes, with clocks moving in various directions around the Earth. And there is another effect of time change, and that has to do with gravity, and I won't go into that much. You can again look at the relativity videotape under the videos tab if you want to hear more about that. But gravity also has an effect. They took these 2 accurate atomic clocks, gave one to a mountain climber. He went up and came back, and his clock had also changed time. It also elapsed at a different quantity of time. So time can change depending upon how fast you're moving relative to someone else. And that's the phenomenon of Einstein's relativity, the relativity of time. Now let's look at a consequence of that. In some sense takes us to the ridiculous limit, but those tests I just described to you verify that this would happen, though we have not done this experiment. It was initially called Einstein's twins paradox, and it is a situation where suppose you had two twins, or a pair of twins, I guess more correctly, but twins, that were born on Earth. Here they are. And what happens shortly after birth is that one twin, twin A, stays on Earth and is lucky enough to live 100 years of age. The other twin, right after birth, takes off in a rocket and rides in a rocket at almost the speed of light, 99.995% of the speed of light. And he then returns for his brother's 100th birthday. Here is what happens at that birthday party. The 100-year-old twin is a full-grown man. Perhaps this is shown a little bit too young, but he's 100 years old and a full-grown man. Here is the identical twin brother. He is but 18 months old and is a toddler. He has actually taken significantly less breaths, his heart has beat significantly less times, and his clock has moved slower. Again, hard to believe, hard to accept, but this is Einstein's theory of relativity, which is the law of relativity, and it has these sorts of consequences that perhaps we haven't measured all of things like this particular test, but we have verified that equation I showed you that is true and that it does work. So if someone is moving very quickly to the speed of light, time slows down. That's the essence of relativity. Time slows down the faster you move. Now, to take a little bit of a side trip here from what I just said, if you go at the speed of light, a clock stops. That's what that equation predicted. If you're in algebra, remember your high school algebra or college algebra, as v equals c in that equation, things blow up and it becomes 1 over 0 or infinity or basically undefined. So at the speed of light, time totally stops. I'd just like to take a brief trip here into some verses in the Bible to demonstrate this concept of time stopping and light and how that is an important aspect of what we're looking at here. If you read the Bible, at least 365 times in that Bible, the word light is mentioned. And the majority of those times, that term light is referred to as an attribute of God. Now, many people correctly and without problem evaluate that as being an attribute of God that is enlightening, sheds light on a dark area where we don't understand something. So enlightening is a way that's often interpreted. But from a perspective of a physicist or an engineer, it has a different meaning. And that's just, I want to go just through 3 Bible verses here to show you what I'm talking about. Here is Bible verse 1 John 1:5, in which it says, "And this is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all." So it says right there that God is light. A literal interpretation of that would be that one aspect of the attribute of God is that he is part light waves. The second one here is a curious one from John 1:8, and this is where John the Baptist, the person who knows that he is the sentinel ahead of the arrival of Jesus Christ, he is asked if he is the Messiah, if he is the person that is foretold in the Old Testament prophecies as the Savior of the world. And he answers that no, he was not the light, but came that he might bear witness of the light. What a curious way to answer it. Are you the Messiah? I should have perhaps said, no, I'm not the Messiah. I'm just the one who came before the Messiah to herald his coming. But no, he talks about light. as if the Messiah, Jesus Christ, God, is in some ways light. And then a final verse here from the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations, chapter 22, verse 5. And there shall no longer be any night, and they shall not have need of the light of a lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God shall illumine them, and they shall reign forever and ever. This is a description of what the Bible believes will be the characteristics of the heaven that our spirits will go to at the end of time, and that we will not need lamps, electricity, oil and gas, or the sun for light, because the Lord God will illumine them. I present these even though some of you are not, or are Bible believers, or not religious in that sense. I just want you to look at these verses from a cold, hard aspect of a physicist talking about this God being light. And if you couple that information that some aspect of God is light, and add to that the concept I set up above, that when something moves at the speed of light or is light, time stops, what that would mean for this God of the universe that created the universe, that he would be outside of time as we know it. And he would not be concerned or bored or anything, would not have any discomfort from the fact that, as we're going to see in the next few slides, that in the Earth's clock, it took a long bit of time for these 6 days, but on the cosmic background radiation clock, it was literally only 6 days. So I just put this as a sidelight about light and what the implications are of Einstein's theory of relativity, that when something is or rides on a light beam, that time stops. So let's put these two things that we've just looked at together. We looked at the Big Bang Theory, the same pictures we looked at. It results in the fact that things are expanding rather quickly, and if this bulk of this expansion, a bunch of this expansion took place at close to the speed of light, and as I told you, some of the galaxies on the outer edge of the universe that we can see today are going very close to the speed of light. If that occurred at very close to the speed of light for a long period of time, that means that this so-called cosmic clock that we're going to see in a second would have significantly slowed. It would not have moved because everything was moving at such a high speed. And so when we take the Big Bang Theory and couple it with this equation from Einstein's relativity theory, this time measurement here, I call delta T universe, is what we know as the cosmic clock, and this is the Earth's clock. When we combine these two together and do some calculations, and in particular there was a particular person well suited to do this sort of calculation. He is Professor Gerald Schrader, who is both a PhD nuclear physicist from MIT and now a practicing and teaching rabbi. So he knew the science of the physics of relativity theory and Big Bang very well, and he knew the words of the Old Testament and the biblical creation story. And when he put those two together, one can end up with a calculation for the cosmic clock. Radiation, first of all, is a cyclical thing, kind of like a sine wave or a pulsing sort of thing, which means it is a clock. And it turns out that when he combined these two areas of technology together, he calculated that this cosmic clock has been ticking for 6 cosmic days, while the Earth's clock has measured, he calculated, about 16 billion Earth years. Now, this might seem to you, your first impression might be that this is some kind of fake calculation. This is somebody that knew the answer he wanted and maneuvered the physics and the science to give the correct answer, but that is far from the truth. It is not the truth. This is straight secular science. When you take the Big Bang Theory, couple it with Einstein's theory of relativity, and have an exponentially expanding universe, this is the result that you get. That the cosmic clock, which has slowed dramatically because of the early expansion of the universe at very high speeds, close to the speed of light, that it, at this point in time today, has been ticking for only about 6 24-hour days. And he predicted just independently, and I showed you earlier with just two measured constants, the 10.9 trillion degree initial temperature of the Big Bang, and I guess I really didn't mention it, but you'll see it in the Big Bang under the video tab, that the current temperature of that radiation is now 2.735 degrees Kelvin. It's very cold, it's very, very low energy radiation, but those two numbers plus these two theories, or these two scientific laws, plus the exponentially expanding universe results in this calculated number, which is straight, secular, unadulterated scientific results. Now, when you take Professor Schrader's cosmic clock calculations, what you end up with is when you have day one on the Genesis clock, that's reported by Genesis, which is measured on the cosmic clock, the cosmic background radiation clock, it turns out that day one equals 8 billion Earth years. So day one goes from here, 16 billion, down to about 8 billion. That's the length of day one in Earth years, but it's one cosmic clock day, the one Genesis day reported in the book of Genesis. Similarly, for days 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you can see day 2 is 4 billion, day 3 is 2 billion, 1 billion, and day 6 is 250 million years long. So this is how one can map the biblical creation days 1 through 6 into Earth years and see what implication that has. And again, two experimentally measured constants, and these two laws of physics have resulted this, and I could spend the next hour telling you, trying to convince you that this is straight secular science. I won't do that. It's not reverse engineered. It's not been fudged or faked or changed. This is straight secular science that gives you this equivalent Earth time to the cosmic background radiation clock time. So let's look at that information that we looked at in part 1, where we looked at this plot of the fossils that have been discovered over time, representative set of fossils. And if you remember up here, the so-called Precambrian plants, it was been determined that all of these 9 areas of the world that have these ancient fossils are indeed plants. In fact, they're plant seeds. They're not parts of plants, they're just plant seeds. They're the only thing that has survived over that length of time. So they're all plants. There are no animals present there. Well, let's put that in terms of what the Bible says in terms of these Earth years. Here's day 3, in which the Earth was created. And the only growing thing, only living thing that was created during day 3 was vegetation, plants. What do we see in the fossil record? Only plants in day 3. Let's go to day 4. A whole Genesis day. It was this length. But the only thing that was growing, now God was creating other things during that day, but the only thing that was growing in terms of a living thing was, it says, vegetation continued to grow. What do we see on day 4? Only plants, no animals. So amazingly, the days 3 and 4 of biblical creation clear up this problem that evolution theorists have had with not being able to find any animals here. The Bible says you're not going to find any, and to date, none have been found. So that's an interesting result of biblical creation that explains this conundrum that evolution theory has about wanting to find some animals in this area so that animals would not so abruptly form here at this particular point in time. They wanted to develop slowly, but this did not happen. Let's look further then. Again, this expanded view of just the first 500 or 550 million years worth of these fossils, or those that were 550 million years or younger. And we see exactly the same plots we looked at in part 1. But now let's look at what Genesis day 5 predicts. Well, it says, first of all, water creatures and fish should be formed. So the formation of these water creatures here is just what is predicted during day 5. They can all come at once. They can all come in a short time period. It says fish were created, and so fish were created during day 5. They were a little bit later than some of the other plants, but they were during day 5. It says sea monsters, and they may be some of these dinosaurs, maybe some of these lizards. That's the only thing that's not exactly pinned down yet in terms of what this sea monster really is. But also birds were created during day 5, and here is the first bird that appeared on Earth. Again, the creatures in the fossil record that happened at a certain time are exactly predicted by the time scale of day 5 of creation. Similar story for day 6. Cattle land animals and man were created, and here are the first mammals just at the beginning of day 6, and man at the end of day 6, but at least man was created during day 6. So what is reported in Genesis in terms of the sequence of these life forms that were formed is exactly in agreement with the fossil record in terms of the times that have been happening. And so the Genesis history correctly predicts the timing of these, in fact, much better than does Genesis, than does the evolution theory predictions for when these things should have happened. Now, the only thing that's a little bit in contention here, a little bit unknown yet, is this idea of a sea monster or a big whale that has been reported in the book of various translations of the chapter 1 of Genesis. It's not specified exactly what. One of the candidates is a mosasaur or a giant sea snake, or there's some other aquatic dinosaurs. We're not sure which one it'd be. Just for your interest, let me show you what a mosasaur is like. We haven't found an old enough one yet, but it's kind of fits along the idea of a big whale or a big sea monster. Here is the oldest mosasaur. It's pictured here as a giant sea snake creature that is here shown eating a giant squid. So you know that's the mosasaur is pretty big. This particular one, the oldest one, is about 85 million years old. It's a little bit too young to be in day 5, but it is 55 feet long and weighs 20 tons. So this potentially something like this or some other creature could be the sea monster or big whale that's reported in Genesis, but it's something that time will tell when what is later discovered in terms of actually pinning down what this sea monster might be. Let's look very briefly at the conclusions that we have from our look at biblical creation history after we've applied a couple of scientific areas to it and seen the implications of that result. First of all, I think the major thing is that 6 days of creation are literally true. They just don't happen to have been recorded on the Earth's clock with the sun and the moon and the timing that we're used to today, but instead were recorded on the cosmic background radiation clock. That clock based upon 2 well-known scientific laws. And so without fudging, without faking, without making the answer be reverse engineered into 6 days, the independent calculation is that 6 days have passed by on this cosmic background radiation clock, and this has happened because time has slowed down so much as the universe expanded so close to the speed of light for such a long time. So that's the most important conclusion I think that we'll see in here. The second one that we've just looked at is that this fossil data that gave some problems with evolution theory now has been explained by biblical creation. On the days when various types of living beings were said to be created in the first chapter of Genesis in the biblical creation story, that's when they appear in the fossil record. The plants on days 3 and 4, the animals on days 5 and 6, including humans on day 6. All of that happens within the timing that is calculated from this cosmic background radiation clock. In other words, the fossil record now makes complete sense. One thing that I have not mentioned that you can see more discussion of if you look at some of the videos on biblical creation under the videos tab is that biblical creation is consistent with no missing link fossils being found. Now, it does not say that no missing link fossils should be found, but by implication it says that God created this being and then that being and then that being and that being, and does not say that there's some intermediate in between there. So the fact that evolutionists have not found missing link fossils is absolutely consistent with biblical creation. We saw also that this point about no animal fossils at times before this Precambrian time was a difficulty for evolution theory, but has been explained in terms of biblical creation that on days 3 and 4 only plants should have been there. There should have been no animals, and that is true. So that's what we've seen and what we've concluded based upon our brief look at biblical creation history. Let's just see what's going to happen on the remaining parts 3 and 4. We're going to find on part 3, we're going to look at Adam and Eve and Noah. We're going to see scientific evidence that they existed, and we're going to find the time at which they first appeared on Earth. And finally, we're going to look at this idea of 1,000-year lifetimes and human races. Things like Adam, Eve, Noah, and certainly 1,000-year lifetimes may seem to you on first blush It's something that's totally unbelievable, totally something that totally could not happen. But yet, in parts 3 and 4, I'm going to show you the scientific support, scientific evidence indicating that these historical accounts literally did happen and are true.